But that summer, I would trudge up every afternoon up the hill to sit with Aunt Nettie on the front porch of that school home. I wouldn't take anything for those long, hot summer afternoons. And we talked at great length. That's when she told me more of her personal life. And she again stated about losing all of her material things. She began to do a lot of reminiscing and how she had to handle that when they had the terrible storm in Wyoming, and about losing Uncle Frank. And she did not tell me that they were in the East, they were at Greenwich. She didn't tell me that, this was told to me later, that when she walked downstairs that morning and she said, "Where are the children?" And they said, "Well, Miss Johnson, we're not having school today because of Mr. Johnson's passing last night." She said, "No, no, get the children. Frank would want it that way." But she told me how difficult it was for her, and then how much Ken was like Frank. And she said to me, occasionally she'd say, "Dottie, Mother Ken, just don't let him know you're doing it." And she'd say to me too, "Oh, he has beautiful hair. Make him take care of it." Ken was so, oh, I'm so glad. He was so gentle, so sweet. I can remember in the morning in the school homes, he would take her coffee, and then he would offer her more, and she'd say, "No, no, no, cup." And she'd say, "Well, just have a cup." And he'd tease her a little bit. She fasted occasionally. She didn't recommend it for everyone. But I would know when she'd gone as much as a 3-day fast, and she never lost her pace. She claimed it gave her clearer thinking and more vitality. And her breakfast, I don't know whether I mentioned that, but it's always the same thing. It was shredded wheat. And she'd pour the hot water over the shredded wheat, 2 biscuits, and then the hot water would be squeezed out, and a little bit of honey, a little bit of milk, and her fresh orange. The food in the school home was really excellent, but very simple, but very well thought out, beautifully done, good nutrition. Then as the summer progressed, and see, I first was born on January the 9th, so that was just 2 weeks after Aunt Mary's death. And her birthday was in October, and we had a very hot October. And the house was a miserable little thing still. And I wanted her for the day. And she sat in the doorway of the little miserable kitchen and the little, where we had a little dining room table. And I went up and got her, and it was to be noon. And I remember her, if I could just paint, she sat there at the table, and I managed to make a beautiful birthday cake. I remember how hard it was to get enough eggs to make the cake, save enough eggs. And I decorated it with the pecans. She sat there, and of course in those days we had an oil stove, and I was trying to get a nice meal, and Kenny was going to come for lunch. And she had a funny look in her eyes, strange to me. And she would pick the pecans off the cake. And she would, the one I'd come in and say, "Aunt May, you okay?" "I'm fine, dear," but she'd say, "There's someone picking the pecans off the cake." Now, that wasn't like her to tease or do that sort of thing, and she had that funny look in her eyes. She was having a problem. It was angina, I think they called it now, we used to call it angina, and the blood was being restricted to the brain, so she had these periods where she was really thinking very poorly. Right after that, and I had these wonderful times with her, of course school had started then, she told Ken, she said, "Ken, I don't want Doc to come see me anymore because of the coming baby." She used to say, "I want the baby to be a girl." And I said, "Don't say that, Aunt May." "Oh, but we're going to have a war." And I'd say, "Well, Aunt May, if we have a war, the girls are going to suffer just as much as the boys." "No, they at least won't be in the trenches." So I never got to see her again. Ken went every day. And even when she died, 3:30 on that afternoon on December 23rd, I didn't go to the funeral. I was just too ill with a coming birth. And I want it to go on record. It is in the bylaws of the museum board of where she's buried. And we have a colony cemetery here, single tax land. It's very, very poorly kept. And yet it's a beautiful site. It's right across from City Hall. And she and Uncle Frank, Mr. Johnson, are buried in quite a nice, it's done well. It's a big concrete sort of thing with a raised concrete border. And little Franklin is in the middle. Now see, he was killed when he was only 2. That is the only thing she never spoke of again, was his death. To my knowledge, she never talked of his death to anyone. She never mentioned to Ken. She never mentioned to me. As far as I know, the closest people to her, she never talked about little Franklin being killed. See, that happened in the classroom, and he fell from a table and hit his little head and was killed instantly. That must have been an awful thing for her to have to face.
What year was that in?
The year she opened in the Bell Building, 1909. 1907 and 1909.
Did you ever talk with anyone who was on board at that time and commented on her reaction? Or what
I don't. You see, the 6 students that started with her were in a cottage now, not in the Bell Building, in 1904. And that was only for 6 weeks. It was a demonstration kindergarten. And out of those 6, we have taped and recorded 3 of those original. But they apparently were not in that group that were in actually the classroom when this happened. So I don't know who was there. I've never found anyone who remembers it. There is the story told, and I don't know how true it is, that when she was called, or she knew the baby was dead, that she held the baby for 2 days and wouldn't let him go. Now, I don't know how true that is. That doesn't sound like her. Not the way she met situations. She was so, well, the way she handled Uncle Frank's death. And yet he was, what people tell me, he died in 1919. I don't remember him at all. Kenny doesn't remember him too well, or didn't. But he was Swedish, tall, quiet, very good looking. We don't have good pictures of him. He did carpenter work, but he was her quiet mainstay. And he talked the shop. We have a delightful picture of the first shop building being built on campus. It's in a museum. And that burned shortly after the kiln got too hot and exploded and it went down in flames. That was the first and only fire on campus, actually. But that must have been very difficult for her to carry on. Now, he always went east with her to Greenwich and to the Port Washington School. In going through, too, Mike, I want to mention this, in going through a lot of the documents here at home this morning, I came to a record of my oldest sister. I had not, to my knowledge, had never seen it. It must have been that I hurriedly, upon her death 6 years ago, I must have just brought it home along with other things, and it's a perfectly beautiful tribute to what Maria Johnson's philosophy meant to her. And she was the oldest of the 6 of us. And she was the one that was sacrificed, so to speak, where I asked Maria Johnson later, why did she let my sister be advanced 2 years instead of keeping her in the chronological group? And she said, I sacrificed her to save the rest of you. And my sister tells of this and what it meant, and yet what the philosophy meant. And she was a real educator. She was so good in the Head Start movement here that the New York Times even came down to observe the Head Start up there in Daphne. It's going to be, the whole thing's going to be in the museum. And then in going through some things too this morning, I came across, we have up at school what you call the merry-go-round, and you call it something else. And I came, the earliest one that they have up there is 36, and we called ours the Outlet. And I came across somewhere, I was editor, I had forgotten. But it reminded me, so I'm talking back in 19, 25, 6. And I noticed here, The Life of a Nickel, something I wrote. But what I remember, too, about the philosophy, you'd be surprised how many of the boys that you didn't think had a thought in their head to want to write, how many people of us were literary. And what wonderful things we wrote as kids. Now, there was a requirement